Hello there, gentle dreamers. Tonight, we journey with Carlisle Cullen, the compassionate immortal who chose healing over hunting across 4 centuries of existence. He is the healer who resisted his nature, the father who built a family from the dying and the lost, the immortal who never forgot his humanity. So, before you settle in, I want to share something small from my heart. I have a dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers before the month ends. If you feel connected to these stories and want to help me grow, I'd be so grateful if you subscribed. Well, now it's time. Let's ease into a peaceful moment together and let Carlisle's remarkable journey carry you softly into rest, where centuries pass like moments and compassion endures forever. London in the 1640s was a city that lived with death as constant companion, where the memory of plague lingered in narrow streets and newer fears took root daily in hearts already worn thin by suffering. The Civil War had torn England apart, king against parliament, brother against brother. And in the chaos of political upheaval, older superstitions found fertile ground in which to grow and spread like infections. People saw evil everywhere because evil was convenient explanation for suffering that had no rational cause, for losses that made no sense, for the grinding poverty and disease that killed children and adults with equal disregard for prayers or piety. In this atmosphere of fear and suspicion, certain men found purpose in hunting monsters, in claiming they could protect good Christian folk from the supernatural threats that supposedly walked among them. Carlisle Cullen was born into this world sometime in 1640 or 1641, the exact year lost to the imprecise record keeping that characterized the lives of common people in that era. Time was marked by seasons and harvests and the births and deaths of monarchs, not by careful documentation of when a pastor's son entered the world in a modest London parish. His mother died bringing him into existence, her life traded for his in that brutal arithmetic that governed childbirth before modern medicine. He never knew her face, never heard her voice, carried no memories of paternal tenderness or comfort. His father, an Anglican pastor whose faith ran to rigidity rather than mercy, raised the boy alone in a household where love was scarce and duty was everything. The elder Cullen was a man consumed by his mission to purge the world of evil, a mission he pursued with zealot's fervor and absolute conviction that God had chosen him for this sacred work. He led raids into the darkness of London's forgotten places, hunts for creatures he claimed threatened good Christian souls, expeditions in search of werewolves and witches and vampires that supposedly lurked in shadows waiting to drag the innocent down to hell. These hunts were brutal affairs, mobs of frightened men carrying torches and crude weapons, following the pastor's certainty into sewers and abandoned buildings, and anywhere else that darkness might hide the supernatural. More often than not, they found only ordinary people whose misfortune it was to be in the wrong place, to look suspicious to frightened eyes, to be unable to defend themselves against accusations backed by mob violence. Innocents died in these raids, burned or beaten or drowned in the name of protecting humanity from monsters, their screams justified as necessary sacrifice in the eternal war between good and evil. Young Carlisle grew up watching these hunts, learning to recognize the signs his father claimed indicated supernatural presence, absorbing lessons in how to track and trap and destroy the creatures that supposedly threatened London. But unlike his father, who seemed to feel nothing but righteous satisfaction when another supposed monster was destroyed, Carlisle felt something else entirely. Doubt crept into his mind when he saw the faces of the accused, when he heard their pleas of innocence, when he watched his father ignore evidence that contradicted his certainties. The boy was intelligent, observant, blessed or cursed with a mind that asked questions even when questions were unwelcome. He saw patterns that troubled him, noticed that the monsters they found always seemed to be the powerless and the poor, that supernatural evil had a convenient tendency to appear in people who had no one to defend them, no resources to prove their humanity, no voice that would be heard over his father's accusations. As Carlisle grew from child to young man, he learned to hide these doubts behind a mask of dutiful obedience. He studied the religious texts his father assigned him, memorized scripture and theological arguments about the nature of evil and humanity's duty to combat it with every available weapon. He accompanied his father on raids, learned to move quietly through darkness, developed the skills of tracking and observation that his father insisted were essential for God's work. But inside, in the private spaces of his own thoughts, where his father's certainty could not reach, Carlisle struggled with growing discomfort about the work they did, increasing suspicion that they were not actually protecting anyone, deepening conviction that the real evil might lie not in supernatural creatures, but in the violence committed in the name of destroying them. He had no choice but to continue, however. This was his world, his role, his inheritance as the pastor's son. His father was aging, growing more rigid in his beliefs, even as his body weakened with the passage of years, his certainty hardening into something that would not bend or question or reconsider. The congregation expected Carlisle to take his father's place when the time came, to carry on the holy mission of protecting London from supernatural threats. There was no other path available to him, no alternative future he could imagine in a world where your father's profession defined your destiny as absolutely as your surname. So Carlisle prepared himself to inherit a mission he no longer believed in, to lead hunts he suspected were murdering innocents, to become the man his father wanted, even as he felt himself dying inside. The isolation of his position was profound and inescapable. He could not speak his doubts aloud, could not question his father's certainty without inviting punishment and accusations of moral weakness or susceptibility to evil's influence. He had no friends in whom he could confide, no companions who might understand the conflict tearing him apart. The pastor's son existed in a strange space between the common people, who feared and resented his father's power, and the religious authorities who approved of the elder Cullen zealotry, but did not actually know the family personally. Carlisle lived in London, but felt utterly alone in it, surrounded by people, but unable to truly connect with any of them, trapped in a role he could not escape and a future he could not imagine wanting. He found what solace he could in learning, in books when he could access them, in careful observation of the world around him. His intelligence was considerable, his capacity for understanding complex ideas far beyond what his narrow religious education strictly provided. He learned to see patterns in illness and injury, developed intuitive sense for how bodies worked and what might help them heal. When people in the parish fell ill, Carlisle sometimes assisted in caring for them, discovering that he had a gift for the work, a gentleness and patience that complemented whatever medical knowledge he could acquire. These are moments of genuine usefulness, of actually helping rather than hunting, brought him satisfaction that his father's missions never did. But these were brief respites, stolen moments between the raids and the religious instruction, and the constant pressure to become the zealot his father demanded. London itself was a harsh teacher, a city where suffering was commonplace and mercy was rare commodity. The narrow streets stank of waste and sickness. The Thames carried filth and probably disease in its dark waters. The buildings pressed too close together, as if conspiring to shut out light and air. Plague was recent enough memory that people still panicked at signs of fever, still painted crosses on doors, and abandoned their neighbours at first sign of illness. Violence was ordinary, whether from criminals in the shadows or authorities in the open, whether from hunger-driven desperation or religious-driven righteousness. Life was cheap in London in the 1640s. Human life, especially if you were poor or powerless or simply unlucky. This was the world that shaped Carlisle Cullen, that taught him about cruelty and injustice, and the terrible things people did to each other while claiming divine sanction. He learned to move through this world carefully, to keep his own counsel, to show his father the obedient son, while protecting his true thoughts in spaces where they could not be discovered and punished. He learned to watch and wait and hope that somehow, someday, there might be a different path available to him, a different future than the one being constructed around him like a cage. He did not know what that future might look like, could not imagine how he might escape the destiny his birth had assigned him. He only knew that the weight of expectation grew heavier with each passing year, that his father's aging body meant the full burden would soon fall on Carlisle's shoulders alone. That time was running out for whatever small freedoms his youth still permitted. And so he existed in this strange suspension, this waiting for a future he dreaded, this performance of dutiful son, while his real self remained hidden and protected in the only place it could survive. He was the pastor's son, the heir to a mission of hunting monsters, the young man who would lead London's righteous against supernatural evil. He was also Carlisle, the boy who doubted everything his father believed, who felt compassion where he was supposed to feel only righteous fury, who wondered if perhaps the real monsters were the ones carrying torches rather than hiding from them. These two selves existed uneasily in the same body, the same mind, waiting for something to break the terrible tension between what he was supposed to be and what he actually was, what he was expected to become, and what he desperately hoped he might somehow avoid becoming. The breaking point was coming, though he did not know it yet. His transformation was approaching, though not the kind his father intended. Not the spiritual transformation into worthy heir of zealous mission. A different transformation entirely was waiting in the darkness of London's sewers, waiting to change everything he thought he knew about monsters and humanity and himself. The raids became Carlisle's responsibility sooner than anyone expected, his father's body failing more rapidly than his faith, age claiming victory where doubt never could. The elder Cullen's hands shook too badly to grip weapons effectively. His legs could no longer navigate the treacherous terrain of London's underbelly. His eyes failed him in the darkness where monsters supposedly lurked. But his conviction remained absolute, his certainty undiminished by physical weakness, his voice still commanding even when his body could not follow where his zealotry demanded. So Carlisle stepped into the role that had been prepared for him since birth, leading the hunts his father could no longer conduct personally, becoming the instrument of a mission he still secretly questioned with every fibre of his being. He approached the work differently than his father had, bringing his intelligence and observational skills to bear in ways the elder Cullen never had. Where his father followed superstition and rumour, Carlisle looked for patterns and evidence. Where his father saw guilt in poverty and strangeness, Carlisle looked for actual proof of supernatural nature. His careful methodology meant the raids killed fewer innocents, which pleased no one. The congregation growing restless with what they perceived as his lack of his father's righteous fury, his unwillingness to see evil everywhere and destroy it without hesitation or mercy. But Carlisle persisted in his careful approach, knowing that if he must do this work, he would at least try to minimize the harm, try to find actual monsters rather than simply victims to satisfy mob bloodlust. And then, impossibly, he succeeded where his father never had. Following patterns of disappearances in a particular district, tracking rumors of pale figures seen entering the sewers after dark, observing details that others dismissed or overlooked, Carlisle identified what he believed was a genuine vampire coven inhabiting the forgotten spaces beneath London streets. The sewers were vast and unmapped, a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers where waste flowed and darkness was absolute, where no sane person ventured unless desperate or hunting. Carlisle studied the area for weeks, noting the times when disappearances occurred, mapping the locations, identifying the most likely entry points to wherever these creatures made their lair. His father, hearing Carlisle's careful presentation of evidence, felt a vindication surge through his failing body, proof that his life work had been righteous all along, that monsters were real, and his son had finally found them. The raid was organized with more men than usual, perhaps 20 or 30 frightened volunteers, carrying torches and weapons, following Carlisle into the sewers on a cold night when fog blanketed London like a burial shroud. The darkness below ground was profound and disorienting, the torchlight creating more shadows than it illuminated, the sound of water flowing through channels echoing strangely off stone walls slick with moisture and worse things. The smell was overwhelming, human waste and rot and dampness combining into an assault on the senses that made men gag and wish they had stayed above ground where air was breathable. They moved slowly through the tunnels, Carlisle leading them deeper into the labyrinth, following instincts he did not fully understand, drawn towards something he could not name but could somehow sense waiting in the darkness ahead. The vampires were real, not myths, not superstition, not innocent people accused falsely. Real creatures of supernatural origin, ancient and powerful and utterly inhuman despite their human appearance. Carlisle saw them first as his torchlight fell across a widened chamber where the ceiling rose higher and the floor had been cleared of waste, creating a space that might have been living quarters for beings who did not live in any human sense. There were 3 of them, pale as corpses, beautiful in the way that poisonous things are beautiful, their eyes reflecting torchlight with an animal gleam that sent terror shooting through every man who saw them. For a moment, everyone froze. Humans and vampires equally surprised by the sudden confrontation, the 2 groups regarding each other across the chamber with mutual shock and rapidly dawning hostility. Then chaos erupted with a violence that overwhelmed rational thought or careful planning. The vampires moved with speed that human eyes could barely track, becoming blurs of motion that separated and attacked the raiding party from multiple directions simultaneously. Men screamed and died, their weapons useless against creatures that moved like wind and struck with impossible strength. The torches fell, or were knocked aside, casting wild shadows that made the carnage harder to track, made it impossible to know where safety might lie or how to escape the massacre unfolding in the darkness. Carlisle saw men torn apart, saw blood spray across stone walls in patterns that would haunt him, saw his carefully organized raid dissolve into pure survival panic as everyone who could still move tried desperately to reach the tunnel entrance and the world above. He was running when the vampire caught him, his torch lost somewhere in the darkness behind, his breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed his terror. He felt something impact his back with enough force to drive him forward onto the filthy ground, felt weight pin him down before he could rise or turn or fight. Then came the pain, sharp and focused and absolutely unlike anything he had ever experienced. Teeth sinking into his throat, venom pumping into his bloodstream along with the vampire, feeding on him. The pain was immediate and catastrophic. Fire racing through his veins from the bite point, spreading with each heartbeat, burning everything it touched. He tried to scream, but his voice would not work. Tried to fight, but his body was already betraying him, strength failing as the venom spread and the vampire drank. Then the creature was gone, pulled away by one of its companions, voices speaking in a language Carlisle did not understand, debate happening above his dying body about something he could not comprehend through the agony consuming him. The vampires fled, perhaps frightened by the number of humans still fighting in the tunnels, perhaps simply satisfied with their kills, perhaps sparing Carlisle deliberately, though he would never know their reasoning. He lay in the filth of the sewer floor, bleeding from the torn flesh of his throat, the venom in his system beginning its terrible work of transformation, his mind still conscious enough to understand with perfect clarity exactly what was happening to him. He knew what vampire venom did. His father had described the transformation in sermons and lectures, had explained how the poison turned humans into monsters, how the change took 3 days of burning agony before the victim died and rose again as creature of evil. Carlisle understood that he was being transformed, that he had perhaps 3 days before he became the very thing his father had spent his life hunting, before he became an abomination that his father would destroy without hesitation or mercy. The terror of this realization gave him strength he should not have possessed, adrenaline or sheer desperate will allowing him to move despite his injuries, to crawl through the darkness toward the tunnel entrance, to somehow find his way back to the surface before the venom progressed too far for movement. The streets above were still dark, still foggy, still London, but now utterly transformed by his new perspective. Everything hurt with an intensity beyond description, the venom spreading through his system methodically, reaching every extremity, beginning the process of stopping his heart and remaking his body into something that should not exist. Carlisle stumbled through alleys, avoiding the few people still out at this hour, knowing that he could not go home, could not let his father see what was happening, could not allow himself to be found and destroyed before he had time to think, to plan, to decide what to do with the few hours of consciousness he might have remaining. He found a potato cellar beneath an abandoned building, a dark hole in the ground where vegetables had once been stored, now empty and forgotten and perfect for his desperate need to hide. He crawled inside and pulled debris over the entrance, covering himself, burying himself alive in darkness and earth and absolute isolation. The transformation was progressing rapidly now, the burning intensifying with each passing moment, spreading from his veins into his organs, into his bones, into every cell of his body simultaneously. He bit down on his own arm to keep from screaming, tasted his own blood mixed with venom, felt his jaw clench so tightly he thought his teeth might shatter. The pain was beyond anything language could describe, beyond what human consciousness should be able to endure without shattering completely. It felt like being burned alive from the inside, like acid dissolving him cell by cell, like fire consuming everything he was and replacing it with something fundamentally different. He could feel his heart changing, its rhythm becoming irregular as the venom rewrote its function, preparing it for the moment when it would stop forever, and yet he would continue. He could feel his lungs burning, the air he breathed becoming less necessary with each passing hour, his body slowly abandoning its dependence on oxygen. He could feel his blood thickening, changing composition, becoming something that would not flow through normal veins, would not carry oxygen or nourishment in ways that human biology required. Time lost all meaning in the darkness of the cellar, seconds stretching into eternities of suffering, hours compressing into moments of clarity between waves of agony. Carlisle prayed when he could form coherent thoughts, begged God to let him die truly rather than rise as monster, pleaded for mercy even as he suspected that no mercy would be granted. He thought of his father, imagined the old man's horror if he could see what his son was becoming, felt shame and grief and terrible guilt that he had failed in the mission assigned to him, had become victim rather than hunter, had allowed himself to be corrupted by the very evil he was supposed to destroy. He thought of his mother, dead, bringing him into the world, wondered if she was watching from heaven and what she thought of her son's damnation. He thought of all the people he had seen killed in his father's raids, wondered if this was divine justice for his participation in those deaths, punishment fitted perfectly to his crimes. The third day brought changes that signaled the transformation's completion. The burning began to concentrate in his heart and throat, the rest of his body going strangely numb by comparison, as if the venom had finished its work in his extremities and was making final preparations for his death and resurrection. His heart stuttered and raced, beating frantically as if trying to stave off the inevitable cessation, fighting against the venom that demanded it stop. His throat burned with a new sensation, different from the transformation fire, something that felt like desperate thirst, like starvation, like need so profound it eclipsed even the pain. He understood somehow that this was bloodlust, the vampire hunger awakening in anticipation of his awakening, preparing him for what he would become and what he would need to survive as that thing. Then his heart stopped. One moment it was beating frantically, the next it simply ceased, the silence in his chest absolute and terrifying. But he did not die. His consciousness remained, his thoughts continued. His body stayed animate despite the absence of heartbeat or breath or any other sign of life. He lay in the darkness of the cellar, technically dead, certainly changed, no longer human, but not yet fully understanding what he had become. Slowly, carefully, he moved his fingers and felt them respond with strength he had never possessed, with precision that seemed impossible. He opened his eyes and saw in the absolute darkness of the cellar, saw every detail of his dirt-walled prison with perfect clarity despite the lack of any light source. He was vampire, monster, creature of evil, everything his father had hunted, everything he himself had been trained to destroy. The realization brought not acceptance but absolute revulsion, horror at what he had become, rejection of this new existence that violated everything he had been taught about good and evil, right and wrong, human and inhuman. He did not want this life, did not want these enhanced senses, or this supernatural strength, or this terrible thirst burning in his throat. He wanted to die properly, wanted to end this abomination before it could begin, wanted to spare the world from one more monster walking its streets and hunting its people. But first, he had to escape the cellar, had to reach the surface, had to see what he had truly become before deciding how to destroy it. He pushed aside the debris covering the entrance with ease that shocked him, strength in his arms far beyond what his human body had ever possessed. He climbed into the night and stood in London once more, but London transformed by his new senses into something utterly different from the city he had known. He could see every detail despite the darkness, hear conversations blocks away, smell blood pumping through veins of sleeping humans in nearby buildings. The thirst in his throat surged at the scent of human blood, demanding he feed, insisting he hunt, promising satisfaction if he would only surrender to this need. Carlisle ran instead, fled into the countryside beyond London, putting distance between himself and the humans whose blood called to him so powerfully. He was monster now, but he was not yet murderer, and he would die before allowing himself to become the thing his father had always claimed vampires were. He would find a way to destroy himself, to end this cursed existence, to die properly even if it meant dying by his own hand. The determination was absolute, his revulsion complete, his rejection of vampire nature total and uncompromising. He did not know yet that death would prove impossible, that his supernatural body would resist every attempt at self-destruction, that the despair waiting for him in the months ahead would be worse than the 3 days of transformation fire. He knew only that he had become evil incarnate, and that evil must be destroyed regardless of cost. The first thing Carlisle attempted was starvation, believing that if he simply refused to feed, his body would weaken and eventually fail, that death would come slowly but inevitably if he maintained his resolve. He found a cave in a forest north of London, far from human habitation, far from the blood scent that made his throat burn with intolerable need, far from anyone who might witness what he was or what he tried to do to himself. The cave was dark and damp and perfectly suited to his purpose, a place where a monster could die alone without harming anyone, without spreading the curse of his existence to innocent victims. He curled into the deepest recess of the cave and waited for starvation to claim him, for his supernatural body to consume itself, for the end to come mercifully and finally. Days passed, then weeks, then months. The thirst in his throat grew from discomfort to agony, from persistent need to desperate craving that consumed his every thought. His body did not weaken in the way he expected, did not show signs of approaching death, did not grant him the release he sought. Instead, the hunger simply intensified, becoming more unbearable with each passing day, the thirst transforming into something that eclipsed every other sensation, every other thought, every other desire. He could think of nothing but blood, could focus on nothing but the need burning in his throat, could exist only in the terrible space between refusing to feed and being driven mad by the refusal. But still, he did not die. His body remained strong despite the starvation. His consciousness remained intact despite the agony. His existence continued no matter how desperately he wished for it to end. When starvation proved impossible, he tried drowning, walking into a river and allowing the current to pull him under, holding himself at the bottom while his lungs filled with water. But he discovered he did not need to breathe, that his body functioned perfectly well without air, that drowning was simply impossible for a creature that had already died in every way that mattered. He tried jumping from cliffs, throwing himself from the highest point he could find, hoping that the impact would destroy his indestructible body. But he healed from the falls within moments, bones snapping back into place, flesh re-knitting itself, his supernatural physiology repairing damage faster than he could inflict it. Every method he tried ended the same way, with him still alive, still vampire, still cursed with existence. He could not escape no matter how desperately he sought death. The months of attempted suicide weakened him in ways that had nothing to do with physical strength. His mind began to fragment under the combined assault of unending thirst and repeated failure to die, his thoughts becoming disjointed and desperate, his grip on sanity loosening with each passing week. The thirst was constant torture, burning in his throat every moment of every day, demanding satisfaction, insisting he feed, promising relief if he would only surrender to his nature and hunt. The temptation grew stronger as his resistance weakened, as the agony became too much to bear, as the months of starvation pushed him toward a breaking point he knew would end in innocent blood spilled and his complete transformation into the monster he had tried so hard to avoid becoming. He was hiding in his cave, delirious with thirst, when the deer passed by outside. A herd of them, perhaps 6 or 7 animals, moving through the forest in the early morning, their hoofbeats soft on the forest floor, their scent carrying on the breeze into the cave where Carlisle lay in his self-imposed prison. The smell of their blood hit him like physical blow, the thirst surging from constant agony to absolute desperation in an instant, his body reacting before his mind could engage, instinct overwhelming the control he had maintained for so long. He moved without conscious decision, launching himself from the cave with speed he had not known he possessed, crossing the distance between himself and the herd in seconds, bringing down the largest doe with efficiency that horrified the small part of his mind still capable of observation and judgment. He fed on the deer with desperate abandon, draining its blood, feeling the terrible burning in his throat ease for the first time since his transformation. The relief was profound and immediate, the agony receding to manageable discomfort, his thoughts clearing as the thirst retreated from all-consuming need to something he could actually think around. He knelt beside the drained animal, his hands covered in its blood, his mouth still full of the taste, his mind slowly processing what had just happened. He had fed. He'd given in to the thirst. He had become the predator his vampire nature demanded he be. But he had not killed a human, had not torn apart an innocent person to satisfy his hunger, had not become the murderer his father would have expected all vampires to be. The realization came slowly, understanding dawning gradually as his starved mind began functioning properly again after months of agony-induced madness. Animal blood satisfied the thirst, not as completely as human blood would have perhaps, but enough to survive, enough to think clearly, enough to exist without the constant torture that had driven him towards suicide and despair. If he could survive on animal blood, if he could satisfy the thirst without killing humans, then perhaps he did not have to be the monster he feared becoming. Perhaps there was a different way to exist as vampire, a path between refusing to feed and becoming murderer, a possibility he had not imagined in his desperation to simply die and end the curse of his existence. He fed on the rest of the herd methodically, draining each animal, learning through practice how to hunt efficiently, how to kill quickly and cleanly, how to satisfy his thirst without waste or unnecessary suffering. The deer died faster than they would have from natural predators, their deaths cleaner than being torn apart by wolves, his vampire strength allowing him to end their lives almost instantly. It was not murder in the way killing humans would have been, was not the evil his father had preached against, was not the damnation Carlisle had feared was inevitable. It was simply survival through means that did not require human death, predation that existed within natural order rather than outside it. The relief that flooded through him was almost as profound as the relief from the thirst itself. He did not have to die. He did not have to become murderer. He did not have to choose between starvation-induced madness and transformation into evil creature that killed innocents. There was a third option, unexpected and unprecedented, but real and achievable. He could live as vampire without living as monster, could exist as supernatural being without abandoning his humanity or his morals or his conviction that human life was precious and must be protected. The discovery filled him with something he had not felt since his transformation, something that felt almost like hope, like possibility, like perhaps his cursed existence might contain purpose after all. Over the following weeks and months, Carlisle perfected his ability to hunt animals, learning to track prey, to move silently through forests, to bring down deer and other large animals with increasing efficiency and skill. He discovered that he could go longer between feedings than he initially thought, that while the thirst was constant, it was manageable if he fed regularly on animal blood, that he did not need to hunt daily or even weekly if he fed thoroughly when he did hunt. The control he developed was hard-won, achieved through careful experimentation and constant vigilance, through never allowing himself to become so thirsty that rational thought became impossible. Through maintaining discipline even when the thirst urged him toward easier prey in human settlements nearby. As his physical needs became manageable, his mind began to heal from the months of despair and attempted self-destruction. The suicidal desperation receded, replaced by cautious curiosity about what his existence might become now that death was no longer his primary goal. He had been given supernatural life against his will, had been cursed with existence he never wanted, had been transformed into creature he was raised to hate and destroy. But now, having discovered he could exist without becoming evil, having found a way to satisfy his nature without violating his morals, he began to wonder if perhaps this curse might be turned toward purpose, if perhaps his enhanced abilities might be used for good rather than evil, if perhaps he might find meaning in immortal life that his brief human existence had never offered. The loneliness was profound and seemingly insurmountable. He was the only vampire he knew who fed on animal blood, the only creature of his kind who chose this difficult path, the only being in existence who understood what it meant to be monster striving toward humanity rather than human corrupted into monstrosity. He could not return to London, could not risk being near his father or the congregation or anyone who might recognize him and realize what he had become. He could not seek out other vampires, could not trust that they would accept his unusual choice or refrain from killing him for rejecting the natural order they embraced. He existed in profound isolation, alone with his decision, solitary in his chosen path. But solitude, he discovered, was price worth paying for the alternative. He had found a way to exist as vampire without becoming evil, had discovered that his nature did not have to define his choices, that supernatural abilities could serve morality rather than corrupt it, that even monsters might choose compassion over cruelty if they tried hard enough. The discovery gave him purpose where before there had been only despair, gave him hope where before there had been only desire for death, gave him reason to continue existing in a world that had transformed him against his will into something that should not exist, but now, impossibly, had found reason to be grateful for the transformation after all. 2 centuries passed, while Carlisle perfected his control over the bloodlust that defined vampire existence. 200 years of constant vigilance and unwavering discipline. Decades upon decades of choosing compassion over instinct, humanity over nature, restraint over the easy satisfaction that human blood would provide. The control he developed was unprecedented among vampires, achieved through sheer force of will and absolute commitment to his principles, through never allowing himself a single exception or moment of weakness that might undermine everything he had built. He trained himself to stand beside humans without feeling overwhelming urge to feed, to smell human blood without losing rational thought, to exist in human society without revealing his true nature or succumbing to the thirst that never truly disappeared, but only became manageable through constant effort. As his control strengthened, Carlisle began to venture back into civilization, carefully at first, testing himself in small towns and remote villages where his presence would not be closely scrutinized, where his pale skin and unusual beauty might be attributed to foreign origin rather than supernatural nature. He discovered that he could pass for human if he was careful, if he remembered to pretend to breathe and eat, if he avoided direct sunlight that would reveal his diamond-like skin, if he moved with deliberate slowness rather than the speed his body wanted to employ. The deception required constant attention, but was achievable, and it allowed him access to the human world he had left behind, the world he still felt connected to, despite his transformation, the world he wanted to help rather than prey upon. He became nighttime patron of the arts, attending concerts and theatre performances and lectures that happened after dark, immersing himself in human culture and creativity and intellectual achievement. The arts fed something in him that animal blood could not satisfy, filled the profound loneliness of his existence with beauty and meaning and connection to humanity, even if that connection was observed from distance rather than truly participated in. He learned languages beyond his native English, discovered that his enhanced memory made acquiring new languages absurdly easy, found that he could master Italian and French and German and Spanish with minimal effort, his vampire mind retaining everything it encountered with perfect clarity. But his primary focus became medicine, the study of how human bodies functioned and failed, how illness progressed and could be treated, how injuries healed or killed, how life could be preserved and extended through knowledge and intervention. He studied at universities across Europe, always at night, always from the margins, absorbing medical knowledge with intensity born from genuine desire to understand and help. His vampire senses gave him advantages human doctors could never possess. Ability to hear heartbeats and detect subtle changes in breathing, capacity to smell infection before visible symptoms appeared, enhanced perception that allowed him to notice details others missed entirely. Combined with his perfect memory and his centuries of accumulated experience, these advantages made him extraordinarily skilled physician, capable of diagnosis and treatment that seemed almost miraculous to the humans he eventually began helping. He practiced medicine quietly at first, treating the poor who could not afford proper doctors, working in places where questions about his unusual abilities would not be asked because any help was better than none. He charged nothing for his services, needed no payment since he had no expenses, found satisfaction in using his cursed existence for good, in saving lives rather than taking them, in proving to himself daily that he was not the monster his father would have believed all vampires must be. The work gave him purpose beyond simple survival, reason to continue existing beyond stubborn refusal to die, meaning to immortal life that otherwise stretched ahead empty and pointless. During these centuries of solitary existence, Carlisle encountered few other vampires, and those he did meet were universally suspicious of his unusual lifestyle and dietary choices. Most vampires were nomadic, traveling constantly to avoid detection, feeding on humans without apparent guilt or hesitation, living according to their nature without Carlisle's moral complications. They found his vegetarian diet strange and unnecessarily difficult, could not understand why he would choose animal blood over the superior satisfaction of human prey, saw his compassion for humans as weakness or delusion rather than principled choice. These brief encounters only reinforced Carlisle's isolation, his awareness that he was fundamentally alone in his convictions, that no other vampires seemed to share his belief that their nature need not define their choices. The one exception was Alistair, a British vampire Carlisle met in the early 1800s, who was nearly as solitary as Carlisle himself, though for different reasons. Alistair shunned all company, vampire and human alike, preferred absolute isolation to any form of social interaction, possessed a deep mistrust of others that bordered on paranoia. But Carlisle, lonely after centuries of solitude, managed to engage him in brief conversation before Alistair's discomfort drove him away. They parted on odd terms, neither quite friends nor enemies, simply two solitary creatures who had acknowledged each other's existence before returning to their separate isolations. It was the closest thing to vampire friendship Carlisle had experienced, and even that was barely more than mutual recognition before parting. In the 1700s, Carlisle's travels brought him to Italy, to the ancient cities where art and culture had flourished for millennia, where history lived in every stone and beauty existed at every turn. He was studying at a university in Florence when he first heard rumours of vampires in Volterra, whispers of immortal beings who ruled from the shadows, who had existed for thousands of years, who commanded respect and fear from vampires across the world. Carlisle's curiosity overcame his caution, his desire to meet others of his kind overriding the danger that approaching such powerful vampires might entail. He travelled to Volterra and presented himself at the ancient fortress where the Volturi made their home, requesting audience with the vampire lords who ruled there. The Volturi were unlike any vampires Carlisle had encountered before. Aro, Marcus, and Caius had ruled the vampire world for over 3,000 years, had created and enforced the laws that governed their kind, had built a civilization of sorts within the supernatural community that existed hidden beneath human awareness. They lived in refined luxury rather than nomadic simplicity, surrounded by art and books and culture accumulated over millennia, served by a guard of powerful vampires whose gifts made them nearly invincible. They were educated and sophisticated, conversant in philosophy and history and art, capable of discussing ideas with depth and nuance that came from thousands of years of learning and observation. But they fed on humans without hesitation or remorse, viewing humanity as prey species existed for vampire sustenance, seeing no moral issue with killing to satisfy their nature. The city of Volterra unknowingly supplied them with steady stream of victims, tourists who disappeared in the night and were never found, locals who vanished and were attributed to natural misfortune rather than supernatural predation. The Volturi maintained careful balance, never taking enough victims to draw serious attention, always covering their tracks, ensuring their existence remained hidden while still satisfying their considerable thirst. Aro, the de facto leader of the three, possessed the gift of reading every thought a person had ever had through simple touch, making him extraordinarily difficult to deceive and dangerously perceptive about people's true natures and intentions. He was fascinated by Carlisle from their first meeting, intrigued by this vampire who chose animal blood over human, who maintained such rigid control over natural instincts, who genuinely seemed to value human life despite being vampire himself. Aro read Carlisle's entire history through a single touch, saw his transformation and despair and discovery of animal blood, understood his motivations and convictions with completeness that conversation could never achieve. Marcus, the second of the three leaders, possessed the gift of reading relationships and emotional bonds between people, seeing the connections that tied individuals together or the absence of such ties. He was ancient beyond measure and deeply melancholy, having lost his mate centuries before and never recovering from the grief, existing in state of profound emotional emptiness that made him seem almost hollow. He found Carlisle's solitary existence understandable, even if he could not comprehend the reasoning behind Carlisle's dietary choice, recognized in him the same isolation that Marcus himself felt despite being surrounded by coven and guard. Caius, the third leader, was the most hostile to Carlisle's presence and principles, viewing the vegetarian lifestyle as weakness and aberration, seeing Carlisle's compassion for humans as betrayal of vampire nature. He argued that Carlisle should be destroyed or converted, that allowing him to continue his unusual existence set dangerous precedent, that vampires who refused to accept their predatory nature were threats to the order the Volturi had spent millennia establishing. But Aro overruled him, fascinated by Carlisle's unique perspective, interested in studying this vampire who had found a way to exist that no one else had discovered or maintained. The Volturi attempted to convert Carlisle to human blood during his stay in Volterra, not through force but through persuasion and example, trying to convince him that his vegetarian diet was unnecessarily difficult, that human blood was superior in every way, that accepting vampire nature fully would bring satisfaction and power his current lifestyle could never provide. They brought him to feedings, exposed him to the scent and sight of human blood, tested his control and his convictions repeatedly. But Carlisle's discipline held absolutely, his commitment to his principles unshakable even in face of temptation and peer pressure, his control so perfect that he could stand in room with freshly killed humans and feel the thirst but not surrender to it. Carlisle lived with the Volturi for 2 decades, studying their civilization, learning from their accumulated wisdom, benefiting from access to their extensive library and their millennia of experience. He engaged in long philosophical discussions with Aro about nature versus choice, about whether supernatural beings were bound by their nature or capable of transcending it, about what it meant to be moral when your very existence required taking life. These conversations were stimulating and genuine. Aro truly interested in understanding Carlisle's perspective, even if he never accepted it as valid for himself. The intellectual companionship partially satisfied Carlisle's loneliness, gave him connection to others of his kind, even if those others fundamentally disagreed with his life choices. But eventually, Carlisle realized he could not stay in Volterra permanently. The Volturi's lifestyle was too different from his own, their casual attitude toward human death too disturbing, their world too removed from the humanity he still felt connected to despite his transformation. He thanked them for their hospitality, promised to remember them as friends despite their differences, and left Italy for the New World, for America, where opportunities might exist to practice medicine more openly, where he might find purpose beyond simple survival and philosophical debate. He arrived in America in the early 1800s, a vampire with 2 centuries of experience and discipline, a physician with knowledge beyond what any medical school could teach, a being who had chosen compassion over nature and maintained that choice through unwavering commitment across decades of solitude. The New World offered fresh start, new possibilities, hope that perhaps here he might find not just purpose, but eventually the companionship he had sought for so long, the family he had never had as human and had not found among vampires, the home that might transform his cursed existence into something resembling the life he had always wanted, but never quite achieved. Carlisle established himself in Columbus, Ohio in 1911, finding work at the local hospital, where his skills quickly earned him reputation as exceptionally talented physician. Other doctors consulted when cases proved too difficult or mysterious for standard diagnosis and treatment. He worked primarily night shifts, claiming preference for quieter hours when he could focus on patients without daytime chaos and administrative demands, using darkness as cover for his nature. His pale skin and cold touch less noticeable in dim lighting than they would be under harsh daylight examination. The hospital staff accepted his eccentricities because his results were undeniable, his diagnostic accuracy remarkable, his surgical skill beyond anything they had witnessed before in careers spanning decades. The local doctor was away when Esme Ann Platt fell from a tree on her family's property. The 16-year-old girl suffering compound fracture in her leg that required immediate medical attention beyond what her parents could provide at home. They brought her to the hospital where Carlisle was on duty, carried her into the emergency area where he waited with his centuries of experience and his supernatural senses that could assess her injuries before even examining her physically. He could hear her heartbeat, elevated from pain and shock but strong and steady, could smell the blood from her broken leg where bone had pierced through skin, could sense that despite the dramatic nature of the injury, she was in no danger of dying if the wound was properly treated and infection prevented. He set her leg with gentle efficiency, his cool hands steady and sure, his movements precise and careful despite the speed with which he worked. Esme watched him through her pain, her eyes tracking his face with fascination that went beyond simple gratitude for medical care. Something in his unusual beauty and gentle manner capturing her attention completely. He spoke to her while he worked, his voice soothing and calm, explaining what he was doing and why, treating her not as child to be patronized, but as intelligent person capable of understanding her own medical treatment. The conversation revealed her sharp mind and kind nature, her thoughtful questions and genuine interest in the world beyond her small-town existence, her dreams of leaving Columbus someday and experiencing life more fully than her current circumstances allowed. The connection between them was immediate and powerful, something neither expected but both felt with intensity that seemed disproportionate to the brevity of their encounter. Carlisle found himself drawn to her warmth and vitality, her very human aliveness that he had not allowed himself to appreciate in centuries of carefully maintained distance from humanity. She represented everything he had given up when he became vampire, everything he protected but could never truly have again, the vibrant mortal existence that was forever beyond his reach, no matter how long he walked among humans. Esme felt something she could not name or explain, attraction that went beyond his physical beauty to something deeper, recognition of gentleness and compassion that seemed to shine through his careful professional manner, sense that this strange pale doctor was somehow exactly what a doctor should be, what a man should be, what she wanted even though she was too young to fully understand what that wanting meant. But she was 16 years old, a child by any reasonable standard, and Carlisle was vampire with over 200 years of existence behind him. The attraction he felt was inappropriate and impossible, something to be acknowledged privately and then firmly suppressed, never acted upon, never even hinted at to the young girl whose leg he had just set with such care. He finished treating her, gave her parents instructions for her recovery, and sent her home with the professional distance he had perfected over decades of medical practice. He thought of her after she left, allowed himself brief moments of wondering what might have been possible if he were human and she were older, if the gulf between them were not so impossibly vast, if he could offer her anything besides cursed existence as vampire companion. Then he put the thoughts aside and returned to his work, to the endless succession of patients who needed his help, to the life he had built from discipline and denial. Esme left Columbus eventually, married a man her parents approved of, moved away, and built the life that was expected of young women in her time and place. Carlisle remained in Ohio for a few more years before moving on, as he always did, when his lack of aging began drawing attention. Relocating to new city and new hospital, continuing the pattern he had established over decades of medical practice. But he remembered the young girl with the broken leg, carried the memory of her warm brown eyes and genuine smile through the years that followed, thought of her occasionally, and wondered if she was happy, if her life had turned out well, if she had found the adventures and experiences she had dreamed of during their brief conversation in the hospital emergency room. The loneliness that had driven him from the Volturi intensified over the years following his encounter with Esme. The awareness of what he was missing becoming sharper and more painful as time passed, and his solitary existence stretched toward its third century. He had found purpose in medicine, had discovered meaning in helping humans, had built life of sorts from his commitment to compassion and healing. But purpose and meaning were not the same as companionship, were not the same as family, were not the same as having someone who truly knew him and accepted him despite or perhaps because of his supernatural nature. He had survived alone for so long, had maintained his principles without support or understanding from others of his kind, had proven that vampire could exist without becoming monster. But survival was not the same as living, and he began to feel the weight of immortal solitude in ways he had not allowed himself to acknowledge during his earlier centuries of simply trying to master his nature and find his purpose. He began to consider, tentatively and with great reluctance, the possibility of creating a companion for himself, of transforming another human into a vampire who might share his vegetarian lifestyle and his commitment to protecting human life. The idea repulsed him, even as it attracted him. The thought of cursing another person with vampire existence, violating everything he believed about respecting human life and allowing people to choose their own destinies. He had not chosen his transformation, had been attacked and infected against his will, had spent years wishing for death before finding way to live with what he had become. How could he inflict that same curse on another person deliberately? How could he steal their humanity and their mortality and their chance at normal human life? How could he justify such action even if his intentions were good and his loneliness was profound? The internal debate continued for years, Carlisle unable to fully commit to the idea but also unable to completely dismiss it. The possibility hovering at the edges of his consciousness like ghost he could not quite exorcise. He told himself that if he ever did create a companion, it would only be for someone who was dying anyway, someone who would lose their life regardless of his intervention, someone for whom transformation would be gift of continued existence rather than theft of human life they were still living. The rationalization felt weak even to him. Justification constructed to make the unthinkable seem acceptable, but it gave him framework for considering the possibility without completely rejecting his own principles. Then came 1918, and the Spanish influenza epidemic that swept across America with devastating speed and lethality, killing healthy adults in their prime, overwhelming hospitals and medical staff, creating death toll that climbed into millions across the world and hundreds of thousands in America alone. Carlisle was working night shifts at a Chicago hospital, one of the few doctors still functioning when so many others had fallen ill themselves, his vampire immunity to disease allowing him to work tirelessly when human physicians were collapsing from exhaustion or infection. The hospital was overwhelmed with dying patients, hallways filled with beds holding people for whom nothing could be done. The medical staff reduced to providing basic comfort while influenza ran its course, killing or sparing patients according to factors no one fully understood. Elizabeth Mason was brought to the hospital in the final stages of the disease, her body consumed by fever, her lungs drowning in fluid, her life measured in hours rather than days. But even dying, even barely conscious, her concern was not for herself but for her 17-year-old son Edward, who lay in another bed equally ill, equally dying. The influenza taking them both with the cruel democracy that characterized the epidemic. Carlisle examined them both, his enhanced senses telling him what his medical knowledge confirmed, that neither would survive the night, that the disease had progressed too far for any intervention medicine could provide. Elizabeth Mason would die, and her son would follow within hours, and there was nothing Carlisle could do as doctor to prevent either death. But Elizabeth somehow sensed what Carlisle was, some dying clarity allowing her to see past his human disguise to the supernatural being beneath. She grabbed his hand with strength that should not have been possible given her condition, her eyes locking onto his with desperate intensity, her voice barely audible but absolutely determined. She begged him to save her son, to do whatever was in his power to preserve Edward's life, to use whatever abilities he possessed that went beyond normal medicine. She did not explicitly name what she sensed in him, did not speak the word vampire, but her meaning was clear and her desperation was absolute. She knew she was dying and accepted her own death, but she could not accept her son's death, could not allow him to die so young with so much life unlived, could not leave the world without knowing she had done everything possible to give him chance at survival, even if that survival came through means she did not fully understand. Carlisle stood beside her bed after she died, listening to Edward's labored breathing in the next bed, feeling the weight of Elizabeth Mason's last request pressing on him with force that made decision feel inevitable. Edward was alone in the world now, both parents dead, no other family to mourn him or miss him if he disappeared. He was 17 years old, on the verge of adulthood, but not quite there. Dying from disease rather than violence or accident, his life ending before it had truly begun. The transformation would curse him with vampire existence, would steal his humanity and his mortality and his chance at normal human life. But it would also save him from death that was otherwise certain, would give him continuation of existence even if that existence was fundamentally different from what would have had as human. Carlisle made his decision in the quiet hours before dawn, acting on impulse and loneliness and Elizabeth Mason's desperate final request before he could reconsider or rationalize his way back to solitary existence. He carried Edward's unconscious body from the hospital, moving with vampire speed through streets emptied by curfew and fear of contagion, bringing the dying boy to his own residence, where the transformation could occur in privacy. He bit Edward's throat and wrists, injecting venom into his system, beginning the 3-day process that would remake the boy into vampire, that would curse and save him simultaneously, that would give Carlisle the companion he had craved for centuries at cost of Edward's human life and future. Edward's transformation was agony for both of them, the boy burning in pain he could not understand, while Carlisle watched and waited and questioned every moment whether he had done right thing or committed unforgivable violation. But when Edward woke on the 3rd day, when he opened his eyes that had changed from green to golden, when he looked at Carlisle with new vampire awareness and supernatural senses, Carlisle felt relief flood through him that was almost overwhelming in its intensity. He was no longer alone. He had a companion who would understand what he was, who would share his existence, who would perhaps share his commitment to protecting human life rather than preying upon it. The loneliness that had defined his existence for over 200 years finally, impossibly, had ended. Teaching Edward to be vampire was both easier and more difficult than Carlisle had anticipated, the process revealing aspects of companionship he had not fully considered during his centuries of loneliness. Edward adapted to his new nature with surprising speed, his intelligence and self-control making the transition less chaotic than it might have been, his willingness to trust Carlisle's guidance allowing them to establish routines and boundaries that protected nearby humans from the danger a newborn vampire naturally posed. But Edward also possessed a gift that complicated everything, an ability to read minds that gave him access to every thought of every person within considerable range, a supernatural talent that made him uniquely equipped to understand Carlisle, but also uniquely burdened by awareness of human thoughts and feelings that most vampires never had to confront. Edward could hear the thoughts of humans they passed on the street, could sense their fears and hopes and mundane concerns, could understand their humanity in ways that made feeding on them morally impossible for someone with Edward's conscience and empathy. He adopted Carlisle's vegetarian lifestyle, not because he was forced to, but because his gift made the alternative unthinkable. Because hearing a person's thoughts and then killing them for sustenance would be psychological torture he could not endure. The shared commitment to protecting human life created bond between Carlisle and Edward that went beyond creator and created, beyond teacher and student, moving towards something that felt almost like father and son, despite the mere 4 years of physical age difference between them. They travelled together through the early 1920s, Carlisle and Edward passing as brothers rather than father and son, given their apparent ages. The cover story of Edward being the younger brother of Carlisle's late wife, simple enough to maintain and difficult to disprove. They moved from Chicago to various cities across the Midwest, Carlisle practicing medicine, while Edward attempted to find his own purpose, his own reason to exist beyond simple survival and resistance to his predatory nature. Edward struggled more than Carlisle had with the meaninglessness of immortal existence, the emptiness of living forever without clear purpose or direction, the weight of centuries stretching ahead with nothing to fill them but endless repetition of feeding and hiding and pretending to be human. In 1921, Carlisle and Edward moved to Ashland, Wisconsin, a small city where Carlisle had been offered position at the local hospital, where the population was small enough that their presence would not draw excessive attention, but large enough that the hospital required a doctor with Carlisle's skills and availability for night shifts. The work was familiar and satisfying, Carlisle falling easily into patterns he had established over decades of medical practice, Edward accompanying him sometimes and watching with fascination tinged with discomfort as Carlisle treated human patients with such obvious care and dedication. Then one night, a woman was brought to the hospital morgue, her body believed to be deceased, carried in by men who had found her at the base of a cliff, her injuries consistent with a fall, her heartbeat so faint that the men who discovered her had assumed she was already dead. Carlisle was in the hospital when they brought her in, was walking past the morgue when a scent reached him that stopped him absolutely in his tracks, familiar and impossible, a scent he had not encountered in a decade, but had never forgotten despite the years and distance. He moved to the morgue and saw the woman's face and recognized Esme Ann Platt, older now, no longer 16, but perhaps 26. Her face marked by suffering that had not been present when he had set her broken leg all those years ago in Columbus. He examined her with hands that trembled slightly despite 2 centuries of practiced steadiness, his supernatural hearing detecting what the humans had missed, the faint flutter of heartbeat barely present but still there, still fighting, life persisting despite injuries that should have killed her. She had fallen from a cliff deliberately, he realized, had thrown herself off intentionally, attempted suicide rather than accident. Her body was broken in multiple places, her skull fractured, her internal injuries severe enough that even if her heart was still beating, she would not survive without intervention that went far beyond what human medicine could provide. She was dying, would be dead within the hour. Another victim of whatever suffering had driven her to take her own life. Edward read Carlisle's thoughts and understood immediately who this woman was, what she had meant to him during their brief encounter a decade earlier, the connection that had formed and been suppressed because she was too young, and he was vampire, and nothing between them was possible. Edward saw in Carlisle's mind the memory of the vibrant 16-year-old girl with warm eyes and genuine smile, saw the contrast with this dying woman whose suffering had driven her to suicide, understood without being told that Carlisle was considering transformation, was debating whether to save her life by cursing her with vampire existence. Carlisle carried Esme from the morgue before anyone could stop him, moving with vampire speed that left no time for questions or intervention, taking her to the house he and Edward shared on the outskirts of town, where the transformation could occur in absolute privacy. He explained to Edward what he was about to do and why, his voice shaking slightly as he described finding Esme all those years ago, treating her broken leg, feeling connection he had not allowed himself to pursue, remembering her through the decade that followed and wondering if she was happy. Now she was dying, had tried to kill herself, had lost something or someone so important that living had become unbearable. He could let her die and respect her choice to end her suffering, or he could transform her and give her new existence, new possibility, new life, even if that life was cursed with vampire nature. Edward listened without judgment, his gift allowing him to understand Carlisle's motivations completely, to sense the loneliness and longing and genuine care that drove this decision, to recognize that Carlisle was not acting from selfishness, but from inability to let this particular woman die when he had the power to save her. Edward said nothing, simply stepped back and allowed Carlisle to do what he had already decided to do, to bite Esme's throat and wrists, to inject venom into her dying system, to begin the 3-day transformation that would remake her into vampire if she survived the process. Esme's transformation was quieter than Edward's had been, her body too damaged to thrash much during the burning, her suffering internal and silent, the venom working to heal her catastrophic injuries while simultaneously converting her cells from human to vampire. Carlisle stayed beside her constantly, monitoring her heartbeat as it slowly strengthened, watching her broken bones knit back together with supernatural speed, seeing her bruised and damaged skin heal and smooth into marble perfection. He talked to her sometimes, even though she could not hear him, explained what was happening and why, told her about vampire nature and vegetarian lifestyle and the choice he had made on her behalf without her permission or consent. When Esme woke on the 3rd day, when her eyes opened and showed the crimson that characterized newborn vampires, when she looked at Carlisle with new awareness and supernatural senses, the first thing she did was smile. Not the confused disorientation Edward had shown, not the horror Carlisle himself had felt at his own transformation, simply a smile of recognition and contentment, as if waking as a vampire in Carlisle's presence was exactly where she had always wanted to be. She remembered him, she explained once she could speak, had never forgotten the gentle doctor who had treated her broken leg with such care when she was 16, had thought of him often through the years that followed, had measured every man she met against the impossible standard he had set during their brief encounter. Carlisle explained what he had done, told her about her suicide attempt and near death, described the transformation he had performed without her consent, offered apologies for taking her human life and cursing her with vampire existence. But Esme did not seem upset or angry or even surprised. She had lost a child, she explained quietly, a baby boy who had died shortly after birth. The grief of that loss combined with her unhappy marriage driving her to the cliff edge and the deliberate fall that should have ended her suffering permanently. Carlisle had not stolen her life because her life was already over in every way that mattered, had not cursed her because existence without her child was already hell, had given her something she had not expected, but found herself grateful for regardless. They fell in love with the ease of people who had already been in love for years without acknowledging it. The decade of separation and the changed circumstances doing nothing to diminish the connection they had both felt during that first meeting in Columbus. Esme adapted to vampire nature with remarkable grace, her gentle personality remaining intact despite the transformation, her capacity for love and nurturing undimmed by becoming supernatural predator. She adopted the vegetarian lifestyle without complaint or difficulty, following Carlisle's example because she trusted him completely, because protecting human life aligned with her own values, because she could not imagine feeding on humans when doing so would disappoint the man she loved. They married quietly in a ceremony that was more symbolic than legal. Two vampires pledging themselves to each other for the eternity that stretched ahead, finding in each other the companionship and love that both had thought was forever beyond their reach. Carlisle had his family now, small but genuine. Edward and Esme, the two people he had transformed and who had become more important to him than anything in his centuries of existence. The house they shared became home in ways his previous residences had never been, filled with warmth despite the cold bodies of its inhabitants, alive with conversation and laughter and the simple comfort of being among people who truly knew and accepted him. But Edward remained alone, the only one of the three without romantic companion. Watching Carlisle and Esme's happiness with a mixture of joy for them and awareness of his own continued solitude. Carlisle noticed Edward's isolation, felt guilt that his own happiness emphasized his son's lack thereof, began considering whether there might be someone out there who could be for Edward what Esme was for him, someone who might complete their small family and give Edward the companionship he deserved. In 1933, Carlisle found Rosalie Hale dying in a street in Rochester, New York, her broken body left in the gutter by the men who had violated and brutalized her, her beauty destroyed by violence, her life bleeding away into the street while snow fell softly around her. She had been 18 years old, engaged to be married to a wealthy man named Royce King, her life seemingly perfect from outside, but hollow and unhappy beneath the surface glamour. Her fiancé and his friends had attacked her after a night of drinking, had raped and beaten her, had left her dying in the street, like garbage to be discarded, her screams unheard or ignored by anyone who might have helped. Carlisle found her while walking home from the hospital, heard her faint heartbeat, smelled the blood, discovered her broken body in the snow. The rage he felt was unprecedented in his centuries of existence, fury at the cruelty and violence that could reduce a young woman to this, anger at the men who had done this and left her to die alone. He carried her home and transformed her, not because he particularly wanted another vampire in his family, but because allowing her to die felt like granting victory to the men who had destroyed her, felt like permitting evil to triumph when he had power to prevent it. He transformed her, hoping she might become companion for Edward, hoping they might find in each other what Carlisle and Esme had found, hoping to complete his family with one more member who would give Edward the happiness he deserved. But Rosalie woke angry rather than grateful, furious at what had been done to her, both by her attackers and by Carlisle, rejecting the vampire existence she had not chosen, mourning the human life and possibilities that had been stolen from her twice over. She adapted to vampire nature quickly, her intelligence and willpower making her physically powerful and controlled despite her newborn status. But emotionally, she remained devastated, grieving for the children she would never have, the normal life she would never experience, the humanity that had been taken without her permission or consent. She never forgave Carlisle completely for transforming her, never became the grateful daughter he had hoped for, never looked at Edward with anything except sisterly indifference, despite Carlisle's hopes that they might become romantic partners. The family adjusted to Rosalie's presence, absorbed her anger and grief, gave her space to process her transformation at her own pace. She was family now regardless of whether she wanted to be. Part of the small coven Carlisle was building from the dying and the lost. Another person whose life he had saved and cursed in equal measure. Another reminder that good intentions did not always produce gratitude or happiness. Rosalie's happiness arrived unexpectedly in 1935 when she was hunting alone in the mountains of Tennessee, tracking a large bear through dense forest, her enhanced senses following the animal's scent and the sound of its movement through underbrush. She found the bear, but she also found something else, someone else, a young man who had encountered the same bear and come out very much the worse for the confrontation. Emmett McCarty was lying in a clearing, his body torn open by the bear's claws, blood pooling beneath him, his life measured in minutes rather than hours. He was still conscious, still aware, his eyes tracking the sky above him with the clarity that sometimes comes in final moments. Acceptance of death written across his face even as his body fought desperately to survive. Rosalie saw him and felt something she had not felt since. Her transformation. Something beyond the constant grief and anger that had defined her vampire existence. He was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with classical features or refined elegance. Beautiful in his strength and vitality even while dying. Beautiful in the way he faced death without apparent fear or regret. She stood over him, watching him die, knowing she could save him, knowing also that saving him meant condemning him to vampire existence, meant making the same choice for him that Carlisle had made for her, meant potentially cursing him with the same grief and anger that she herself felt constantly. But she could not let him die. The realization came with absolute clarity. The understanding that this man dying in front of her was somehow important, somehow meant to be saved, somehow destined to be part of her existence in ways she could not explain or rationalize. She gathered him in her arms, this massive man who was still larger than her despite her vampire strength, and began running, carrying him through over 100 miles of forest and farmland, moving with supernatural speed toward home, toward Carlisle, who could complete the transformation she did not trust herself to perform correctly. She burst into the house with Emmett dying in her arms, blood covering them both, her face desperate and determined in ways the family had never seen from her before. She begged Carlisle to save him, to transform him, to give him the vampire existence she herself had rejected and resented. Carlisle examined Emmett's wounds, assessed how little time remained, made his decision quickly, because hesitation would mean allowing Rosalie's choice to die with this young man she had carried so far. He bit Emmett and began the transformation, watching Rosalie's face as she watched Emmett burn through the 3-day change, seeing hope and fear and something that looked almost like love in her expression. Emmett woke as a vampire with enthusiasm that shocked everyone who witnessed it, his personality apparently undimmed by transformation, his natural optimism and good humor surviving the burning and emerging intact on the other side. He adapted to vampire nature with ease that seemed almost careless, accepting his new existence without apparent grief or regret, finding joy in his enhanced strength and speed, rather than mourning what he had lost. Within hours of waking, he was laughing, joking, treating his transformation like adventure rather than curse. His attitude so different from Rosalie's bitter anger or Edward's brooding melancholy that he seemed almost like different species, despite being exactly the same kind of vampire. Rosalie and Emmett were inseparable from the moment he woke. their connection immediate and absolute, their love obvious to everyone who saw them together. Emmett adored Rosalie with uncomplicated devotion that asked nothing except her presence, that accepted her anger and grief without trying to fix or diminish them, that simply loved her as she was without conditions or expectations. Rosalie softened in his presence, her constant rage easing into something more manageable, her grief over lost humanity balanced slightly by gratitude for this one good thing her vampire existence had brought her. They were complete together in ways that neither was alone, their relationship becoming a foundation that allowed Rosalie to finally begin accepting her transformation, even if she never quite forgave it. The family was 5 now: Carlisle and Esme and Edward and Rosalie and Emmett, a coven that functioned almost like human family despite their supernatural nature, relationships defined by love and choice, rather than simple proximity or shared feeding grounds. Carlisle watched his growing family with satisfaction that bordered on joy, seeing the home he had built from his transformations becoming something real and stable and good. Edward remained alone, the only one without romantic partner. But even Edward seemed happier with Emmett's arrival, the house filled with laughter and warmth that had been absent before, the weight of immortal existence somehow lighter when shared with others who understood. They established patterns that would define their existence for decades to come, moving every few years to avoid suspicion about their lack of aging, maintaining cover stories that explain their relationships and their unusual characteristics, perfecting their ability to pass as human even as they lived as vampires. Carlisle continued practicing medicine wherever they settled, his skills and dedication making him valuable to any hospital that employed him. Esme found joy in creating homes for them, in decorating and arranging spaces that felt warm despite housing cold beings, in nurturing her family, even though none of them required traditional care. Edward pursued education endlessly, studying music and literature and languages, filling his immortal existence with knowledge and culture. Rosalie and Emmett simply loved each other, their relationship providing anchor and purpose that both had lacked before finding each other. In 1948, everything changed again when 2 vampires appeared at their home in upstate New York, arriving without warning or invitation, simply walking up to the house as if they had been expected all along. The woman was tiny and pixie-like, her hair cut short and spiky, her face alight with excitement and certainty. The man beside her was taller and leaner, his expression wary and uncomfortable, his posture suggesting someone ready to flee at any moment. Alice and Jasper, they introduced themselves, and Alice explained that she had seen them in her visions, had known they would become family, had tracked them across the country based on future events she witnessed before they occurred. Alice possessed the gift of seeing the future, or rather, seeing possible futures based on decisions people made, her visions shifting and changing as choices altered outcomes, giving her roadmap of probability rather than certainty. She had seen herself and Jasper joining the Cullens, had seen decades of future happiness with this family, had followed her visions from Philadelphia to this house in New York, where she knew they would be welcomed. Jasper possessed different gift, the ability to sense and manipulate emotions in those around him, to feel what others felt, and to change those feelings through his supernatural talent. He was deeply uncomfortable with this ability, disturbed by the constant awareness of others' emotions, haunted by past he did not discuss, but that clearly weighed on him heavily. Carlisle welcomed them despite his uncertainty, trusting Alice's visions enough to give them chance, seeing in Jasper's haunted expression something that resonated with his own early years of struggling with vampire nature. Alice explained that she had no memories of her human life, that she had woken as vampire with no knowledge of who she had been or who had transformed her, that her first conscious memory was of having visions of the future and specifically of Jasper. She had found Jasper in a diner in Philadelphia in 1948, had walked up to him and announced that they were going to fall in love and join a family of vampires who did not feed on humans, and somehow Jasper had believed her enough to follow. Jasper's story emerged slowly over the following weeks, his past revealed in fragments rather than complete narrative. He had been transformed during the Civil War, had spent decades in the South working for a vampire named Maria, who created armies of newborn vampires to fight territorial wars against other covens. He'd been soldier and trainer, had created and then destroyed hundreds of newborn vampires, had lived in constant violence and bloodshed, his gift forcing him to feel the fear and pain of every vampire he killed, the emotional toll accumulating until he could barely function under the weight of so much absorbed suffering. Alice had saved him from that existence, had offered him different path, had shown him through her visions that peaceful existence was possible, that he did not have to live in violence and death, that there was family waiting who would accept him despite his past. But transitioning to vegetarian lifestyle was extraordinarily difficult for Jasper, his decades of feeding on humans and his constant exposure to human emotions making resistance nearly impossible. He struggled daily with the thirst, slipped occasionally despite his best efforts, hated himself for his weakness even as the family forgave him and helped him maintain his commitment to their shared values. Carlisle worked with Jasper patiently, drawing on his own centuries of experience with bloodlust and control, understanding better than the others what Jasper faced in trying to change fundamental patterns established over decades. He saw in Jasper's struggle reflection of his own early years, the desperate attempt to live according to principles that violated vampire nature, the constant vigilance required to maintain control, the weight of choosing compassion over instinct day after day without respite. Carlisle's patience and understanding gave Jasper hope that success was possible, that he might eventually develop the control that seemed to come so naturally to Carlisle and Edward, that he might become the person Alice's visions showed him he could be. The family was 7 now, complete in ways that felt almost inevitable, as if these specific individuals were always meant to find each other, to build this unusual coven that functioned by rules no other vampires seemed to follow. They were Carlisle's family, created deliberately or accidentally, transformed by his hands or brought to him by circumstance, but all of them choosing to stay, choosing to accept his leadership and his values, choosing to be part of something larger than themselves. For Carlisle, who had spent over 2 centuries alone, who had believed he would exist in solitude forever, the family represented achievement beyond anything he had imagined possible. He had proven that vampires could choose compassion over nature, could live without killing humans, could build relationships and families and homes that felt genuinely good, despite being built by creatures that should have been evil. They established their final patterns, the roles each would play in maintaining their cover stories and their existence. Rosalie and Jasper would pose as twins, taking the surname Hale, their similar colouring making the deception believable. Alice would take the Cullen name, posing as Carlisle and Esme's adopted daughter, despite her appearance being closest to Jasper's age. Edward, Emmett would also be Cullens. The family story complex, but maintainable if everyone remembered their parts. They would move together, attend school together when their apparent ages required it, build lives in each new location that felt as normal as possible, despite the supernatural truth beneath the surface. They were family now, bound not by blood, but by choice, by shared values, by love that transcended their predatory nature, by commitment to the impossible ideal Carlisle had discovered centuries ago in a cave with a herd of deer, the ideal that monsters might choose to be something better than what nature demanded they become. Shortly after Emmett's transformation and integration into the family, Carlisle began searching for a new location where they might settle, somewhere isolated enough that their unusual characteristics would draw less scrutiny, somewhere rainy enough that the constant cloud cover would allow them to move about during daytime without revealing their sparkling skin, somewhere with good hospital where Carlisle could practice medicine and maintain the cover story that explained their presence and their resources. He studied maps and climate patterns, researched small towns across the northern United States, looked for places where the combination of weather and geography and population density might allow his family to exist with minimal risk of exposure or discovery. He discovered Forks, Washington, a tiny town on the Olympic Peninsula where rain fell more days than not, where the sun was a rare visitor rather than constant presence, where the thick forest provided hunting grounds and the small population meant less chance of their nature being discovered or their lack of aging being noticed too quickly. The town was perfect for their purposes, isolated and overlooked, tucked away on the western edge of the continental United States, where the Pacific Ocean met ancient forests, where the weather was reliably overcast and gloomy, where the kind of people who chose to live there valued privacy and minded their own business. It was the kind of place people moved away from rather than toward, where newcomers were unusual enough to be noticed, but accepted quickly if they proved themselves useful and non-threatening. Carlisle secured position at the local hospital, his credentials and experience making him extraordinarily valuable to medical facility that struggled to attract and retain qualified physicians in such remote location. His references were impeccable, his skills undeniable, his willingness to work night shifts and holidays and whenever he was needed, making him seem like answer to prayers for hospital administrator who'd been operating short-staffed for years. The family purchased property outside town limits, a house surrounded by forest where they could come and go without constant observation, where their activities could remain private even in small community, where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the distance from neighbors meant their unusual hours and habits would not be subject to casual scrutiny. They settled into Forks with the ease of long practice, each family member knowing their role, their cover story, their part in the careful deception that allowed them to live among humans. Carlisle became Dr. Cullen, the brilliant and dedicated physician who worked impossible hours and never seemed tired, whose diagnostic abilities bordered on supernatural, whose patients recovered at rates that seemed miraculous. Esme became his wife, the warm and gracious woman who renovated their house with impeccable taste, who was always willing to help with community projects, who seemed genuinely interested in the small town life they had adopted. The others became their adopted children. 5 young people with complicated backstories that explained their presence and their relationships, their unusual beauty attributed to good genetics, their pale skin to spending too much time indoors, their golden eyes to unique genetic trait or perhaps colored contact lenses. They had been in Forks only a few weeks when the first encounter occurred, when the presence of vampires in the area triggered transformation they did not anticipate, did not expect, did not understand, until they saw the massive wolves that appeared in the forest during one of their hunting expeditions. The wolves were far too large to be natural, standing taller than horses when measured at the shoulder, their bodies rippling with muscle that seemed impossible for canine anatomy, their eyes showing intelligence that no animal should possess. Edward heard their thoughts before the others saw them, heard human consciousness inside wolf bodies, heard confusion and rage and protective instinct driving these creatures toward confrontation. The Quileute tribe, native people who had lived on the peninsula for thousands of years, carried in their bloodlines the genetic capacity to transform into shapeshifters, giant wolves designed by nature or magic or ancient necessity to protect their people from supernatural threats, specifically from vampires who might prey on the tribe. The transformation was hereditary but dormant, triggered only by the presence of vampires nearby. The genetic switch activated by proximity to the Cold Ones, as the tribe's legends called them. For generations the gene had remained inactive, no vampires coming close enough to the Quileute lands to trigger the change, the stories of shapeshifters becoming mythology rather than living reality. But the presence of Carlisle's family triggered the transformation in tribal members who carried the gene, the proximity of vampires activating defensive mechanism that had lain dormant since the last vampire visitors, perhaps a century or more before. Young men from the tribe began phasing unexpectedly, their bodies transforming into massive wolves whenever their emotions ran high, their normal lives disrupted completely by supernatural change they did not understand and could not control. The transformation was violent and disorienting, their human consciousness merging with wolf instincts, their perception of the world fundamentally altered by enhanced senses and pack mentality that connected them telepathically to others who had also transformed, creating bond that was intimate and inescapable and utterly unprecedented in their human experience. The wolves tracked the Cullens easily, their enhanced senses detecting vampire scent clearly despite the rain and wind that should have dispersed it, their instincts identifying the family as threats that needed to be eliminated or driven away to protect the tribe. The pack, led by Ephraim Black, the alpha whose authority the others could not resist even if they wanted to, whose commands were absolute within the pack hierarchy, prepared for confrontation, ready to destroy the vampires who had invaded their territory, whose presence had triggered transformations that would define and limit the lives of every pack member for as long as the vampires remained nearby. The young men who had phased were warriors now, soldiers in war they had not chosen, bound to protect their people even at cost of their own happiness or freedom, or the normal lives they had been living before the transformation claimed them. Carlisle understood almost immediately what was happening when Edward described the thoughts he had heard from the wolves. When the family compared notes on what they had seen and sensed during their encounter, he knew the legends of shapeshifters, had heard stories during his time with the Volturi about tribes in various parts of the world who transformed into animal forms to fight vampires, who served as natural check on vampire predation, who existed in uneasy balance with the supernatural beings they were designed to destroy. He had never encountered shapeshifters personally, had believed the stories might be exaggerated or entirely mythological, but now faced with evidence of their existence, he recognized the danger his family faced and the responsibility he bore for triggering transformations in young people who had not asked for this burden. The first face-to-face encounter happened on neutral ground, arranged through careful signaling and approached with extreme caution on both sides. The boundary between Quileute land and the area the Cullens had been hunting serving as meeting place where neither group could claim territorial advantage. Carlisle led his family carefully, his hands visible and empty, his posture non-threatening, his entire demeanor radiating peaceful intent, even as the massive wolves circled them, growling, their enormous bodies tense and ready to attack at any sign of aggression. The wolves were terrifying even to vampires, their size and strength and obvious coordination making them genuinely dangerous opponents, capable of tearing apart vampires with teeth and claws, their supernatural heat burning vampire flesh in ways that normal fire would. Ephraim Black stood at the center of the pack in his wolf form, larger than the others, his black fur thick and glossy, his authority absolute, his mind making calculations about threat and response, about whether these vampires could be tolerated or must be destroyed regardless of what they claimed about their intentions. He had the responsibility of protecting his people, of ensuring that the transformations his young men had undergone served purpose beyond simple inconvenience and disruption, of justifying the burden they now carried by eliminating the threat that had triggered their change. Carlisle spoke to them calmly, addressing them as equals rather than animals, recognizing their intelligence and their humanity despite their wolf forms, showing respect for their nature just as he hoped they might respect his family's unusual characteristics. He explained that his family fed on animal blood exclusively, that they had never harmed humans and never would, that their presence in Forks was meant to be permanent or at least long-term, that they wanted peaceful coexistence rather than conflict. He offered information about his families, nature and their history, demonstrating through transparency that they had nothing to hide, that their unusual dietary choice was genuine commitment rather than temporary expedient, that they had maintained this lifestyle for decades and would continue maintaining it indefinitely. Edward's gift proved crucial during these negotiations. His ability to read minds, allowing him to hear the wolves' thoughts even in their animal forms, to understand their concerns and fears more completely than words alone could convey, to communicate information back to Carlisle about what arguments might be most effective, what assurances the pack needed, what compromises might be acceptable to both sides. The wolves were deeply suspicious of vampires who claimed to protect humans, had ancestral memories of vampire predators who had threatened the tribe in generations past. Stories passed down through centuries about Cold Ones who had hunted Quileute people. who had killed without mercy or remorse, who had viewed the tribe as nothing more than convenient food source. But Carlisle's sincerity was evident even to skeptical wolves, his commitment to protecting human life clear in every word and gesture, his obvious distress at the idea that his presence had forced young tribal members into transformations they had not chosen and might not want. He understood their situation more deeply than they initially realized, understood what it meant to be changed into something supernatural against your will, to have your normal life stripped away by forces beyond your control, to be forced into existence you never asked for and might not want. His empathy was genuine, and the wolves sensed it, their hostility easing slightly as they recognized that this vampire understood them in ways most vampires never would or could, that he saw them as people rather than obstacles, that he genuinely regretted the disruption his presence had caused. The negotiations continued over several meetings, each encounter building trust incrementally, each conversation revealing more common ground than either side expected to find. Ephraim Black eventually phased back to human form to speak directly with Carlisle, the two leaders finding they had more in common than their different natures would suggest. Both men burdened with responsibility for protecting their families, both committed to avoiding unnecessary violence, both willing to compromise if compromise meant peace rather than warfare. They worked out terms carefully over days and weeks of discussion, each side making concessions, each side accepting limitations they would not have chosen freely but could live with as price of peace. The treaty they eventually agreed to was simple in its core requirements, but profound in its implications for both groups. The Cullens would never bite a human, whether to feed or to transform, whether on Quileute land or anywhere else within the region. They would not trespass on Quileute territory, would respect the boundaries the tribe established, would stay away from the reservation and tribal lands entirely, treating the invisible line between territories as absolute barrier they would never cross. In exchange, the Quileutes would not reveal the Cullens' nature to other humans, would allow them to live in Forks peacefully, would not attack them as long as the terms of the treaty were maintained, would consider them neutral parties rather than enemies despite the natural enmity between their species. The agreement was binding on both sides, passed down through generations as sacred obligation, maintained through honor and mutual benefit, rather than written contract or legal enforcement. The treaty represented unprecedented peace between natural enemies, proof that even species designed to destroy each other could find ways to coexist if both sides valued peace more than they valued following their instincts. It was compromise born from mutual respect and shared commitment to protecting the humans both groups cared about, recognition that warfare between them would harm the innocent people they were both trying to protect. The treaty line was established physically, marked stones and natural landmarks, creating boundary that both sides agreed to respect, invisible to humans, but absolutely clear to vampires and wolves who understood its significance. The line represented more than simple geographical division, represented the commitment both sides had made to restraint and coexistence, embodied the trust that had been built through careful negotiation and demonstrated good faith. Crossing the line meant breaking the treaty, meant declaring war, meant choosing conflict over the peace that both sides had worked to achieve. Carlisle felt profound relief when the treaty was finalized, grateful that his family could remain in Forks without constant threat of war, satisfied that they had achieved peace through negotiation rather than force, proud that his commitment to protecting human life had been tested and proven genuine enough to earn trust even from beings designed by nature to destroy vampires. The weight of knowing his presence had triggered unwanted transformations in innocent young men never fully lifted, but the treaty at least ensured that those transformations served protective purpose, rather than simply causing disruption and suffering without benefit. The family settled into life in Forks with the treaty established, their existence gaining stability they had not experienced in previous locations. The years in Forks were peaceful and fulfilling, but eventually, the inevitable problem of not aging forced them to leave, departing reluctantly, but knowing they would return someday when enough time had passed. Forks remained special in Carlisle's memory, the place where peace had been possible, where home had felt real, where they would return when the decades made it safe to start again. The family returned to Forks in 2003, nearly 70 years after they had first lived there, long enough that anyone who might remember them from before would be elderly or deceased, long enough that their return would seem like coincidence rather than impossible pattern, long enough that the treaty could be reinstated with the new generation of Quileute, who had inherited the shapeshifter gene and the responsibility of protecting their people. Carlisle contacted the tribe before the family actually moved back, reaching out through carefully maintained connections to ensure that their return would not violate the agreement or trigger unnecessary conflict, explaining that they wished to come home to the place they had loved, that they would honor the treaty exactly as before, that they hoped for the same peaceful coexistence that had defined their previous residence. The current generation of Quileute leadership agreed to reinstate the treaty, the terms unchanged from the original agreement, the boundaries and restrictions remaining exactly as Ephraim Black and Carlisle had negotiated decades before. There were no active shapeshifters at the time of the Cullens' return, the gene dormant in the absence of vampire presence, but both sides understood that the family's arrival would likely trigger transformations in tribal members who carried the genetic capacity, that young men would phase and bind themselves to pack mentality and protective duty because vampires had returned to the peninsula. It was accepted cost of allowing the Cullens to return, necessary burden that the tribe was willing to bear in exchange for maintaining peace and ensuring that these particular vampires remained committed to their unusual principles. Carlisle resumed his position at Forks Hospital, his credentials even more impressive now than they had been 70 years earlier, his reputation preceding him through carefully maintained professional connections and strategically placed references that made his qualifications seem absolutely legitimate and his gaps in employment history seem reasonable rather than suspicious. He became chief of surgery within months, his skills and dedication making him invaluable to the small hospital that served not just Forks, but the entire surrounding region, his willingness to work any shift at any time making him beloved by staff and administration alike. The hospital functioned better with him there, mortality rates dropping, patient satisfaction increasing, the quality of care improving measurably, simply because Carlisle brought 3.5 centuries of medical experience to every case he treated. The house the family purchased was the same property they had owned before, the original structure long since demolished and replaced, but the land itself familiar and welcoming. The forest surrounding it still thick and dark and perfect for their needs. Esme threw herself into renovating and decorating with joy that came from finally returning to place that felt like home rather than temporary stopping point, transforming the modern structure into something that felt warm and lived in, despite housing beings who generated no heat and technically did not live at all. She created spaces for each family member that reflected their personalities and interests, filled the house with beautiful things that made existence feel meaningful rather than simply endless, turned four walls and a roof into home through the same nurturing instinct that had defined her human life and survived her transformation intact. The others enrolled in Forks High School for what felt like the 1,000th time in their long existences, playing their parts as Carlisle and Esme's adopted children, maintaining their cover stories about complicated family situations that explained why 5 teenagers of similar ages would all end up in the same household. Edward found the return to high school particularly tedious, his mind far too advanced for the curriculum offered in small-town public school, his awareness of his classmates' thoughts making normal teenage social interaction exhausting and often disturbing. He sat through classes he could have taught better than the teachers, completed assignments that insulted his intelligence with material he had mastered decades or centuries before, endured the social dynamics of high school with barely concealed boredom and irritation that made him seem aloof and unapproachable to his human classmates. Rosalie and Jasper played their roles as Hale twins, their similar coloring making the deception believable, their apparent aloofness attributed to being new students rather than to their supernatural nature. Alice charmed everyone she encountered with her enthusiasm and apparent prescience about social dynamics, using her gift of seeing the future to navigate high school politics with ease that seemed uncanny. Emmett approached high school with his usual good humor, finding amusement in the absurdity of pretending to be a teenager when he had experienced so much more, turning the tedious exercise into game he could enjoy through sheer force of positive attitude. Then Bella Swan arrived in Forks in January of 2005, the police chief's daughter returning to live with her father after years in Arizona with her mother. And everything changed for Edward in ways that shocked him and terrified Carlisle. Edward's first encounter with Bella in biology class was catastrophic, her scent hitting him with force that nearly destroyed his centuries of control, her blood calling to him more powerfully than any humans ever had, the thirst rising in him with intensity that made rational thought almost impossible. He gripped the edge of the lab table hard enough to leave finger-shaped dents in the solid wood, his body rigid with the effort of not attacking, his mind screaming at him to feed, while his conscience equally desperately commanded him to maintain control and protect this innocent girl from the monster he suddenly felt himself becoming. He fled the classroom before the period ended and seriously considered leaving Forks entirely, abandoning his family rather than risk killing this one human girl whose blood sang to him in ways that seemed specifically designed to test every ounce of restraint he possessed. He drove to Alaska, putting hundreds of miles between himself and temptation, calling Carlisle to explain that he could not stay in Forks, that Bella Swan's presence made the town uninhabitable for him, that her scent was so appealing it overwhelmed his control in ways nothing else ever had. Carlisle listened with growing concern, understanding immediately that Edward was experiencing something unprecedented, that this was not normal bloodlust but something far more dangerous and far more significant. But Edward returned after a week, drawn back by a fascination that went beyond simple bloodlust, intrigued by the fact that he could not read Bella's mind, that her thoughts were completely silent to him when everyone else's consciousness was open book he could not avoid reading. The combination of irresistible blood and impenetrable mind created obsession that quickly evolved into something deeper, something that looked remarkably like love even though Edward tried desperately to fight it, knowing that loving Bella meant endangering her, that his presence in her life was threat to her safety regardless of his intentions or his control. He watched her constantly, following her home at night and sitting in her room while she slept, convincing himself he was protecting her when really he was feeding his obsession, unable to stay away despite knowing that proximity increased the danger exponentially. Carlisle watched Edward's fascination with Bella with mixture of concern and understanding, recognizing the same pattern he himself had experienced with Esme, the inability to stay away from one specific human despite knowing that proximity meant danger, the way one person could become singularly important in ways that defied logic or self-preservation. He counseled Edward carefully, reminding him of the control he had spent decades perfecting, offering support and guidance, while also acknowledging the very real risk that Edward's obsession posed to both Bella and to the family's continued presence in Forks. If Edward lost control, if he killed Bella, or exposed their nature, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for him, but for all of them. The treaty with the Quileutes would be violated immediately and permanently. Their peaceful existence would end in warfare or forced relocation. Everything they had built in Forks over 2 separate periods of residence would collapse. The situation became dramatically more dangerous when Edward saved Bella's life in the high school parking lot in March, using his supernatural speed and strength to stop Tyler Crowley's van from crushing her against her truck. Acting on instinct without thinking through the implications of revealing his ability so publicly, he appeared beside her impossibly fast, stopping a multi-ton vehicle with his bare hands, leaving a hand-shaped dent in the van's side, protecting her body with his own in ways that should have been physically impossible for a human teenage boy. Witnesses saw what happened, or saw enough to know that something impossible had occurred, their testimonies conflicting because what they witnessed did not match what their brains insisted was possible. Carlisle treated Bella in the emergency room afterward, his professional manner hiding his deep concern about what Edward had done, what witnesses might have seen, what questions Bella herself might now be asking about the boy who had appeared beside her impossibly fast and stopped a vehicle that should have killed them both. He examined her carefully, finding only minor injuries despite the traumatic nature of the incident, her body protected by Edward's intervention, but her mind clearly working through what had happened, trying to reconcile the impossible with the evidence of her own senses. Carlisle saw in her eyes that she knew something impossible had happened, that she was intelligent enough to recognize that Edward's explanation about adrenaline and confusion could not account for what she had experienced, that she would not simply dismiss the incident and move on with her life without seeking answers to questions that could prove dangerous for everyone. Bella was not seriously injured despite the dramatic nature of the incident, suffering only minor cuts and bruises that Carlisle treated efficiently, his cool hands gentle and steady as he cleaned her wounds and checked for signs of concussion or internal injury, his voice calm and reassuring even as his mind calculated the potential damage Edward's impulsive rescue might have caused. He could hear her heart beating steadily, could smell her blood where it seeped from small cuts on her forehead, could sense her awareness and intelligence as she watched him work and clearly thought about what had happened and what it might mean. She thanked him politely when he finished treating her, her manner courteous, but her eyes thoughtful in ways that worried him deeply. Edward and Bella's relationship developed over the following months, despite Edward's attempts to maintain distance, despite his awareness that loving her meant endangering her, despite Carlisle's gentle warnings about the risks they were all taking by allowing this attachment to deepen and become more complicated. They spent increasing amounts of time together, Bella drawn to Edward by the same mysterious force that drew him to her, their connection deepening into something that looked like genuine love rather than simple teenage infatuation. Edward introduced Bella to the family gradually, bringing her to the house, allowing her to see how they lived and interacted, letting her witness their relationships and their unusual household dynamics. Bella eventually learned the truth about the Cullens' nature through combination of research and observation and Edward's eventual confession, discovering through her own investigation that they were vampires, that everything supernatural she had suspected was real, that the boy she had fallen in love with was technically dead and survived by drinking blood, even if that blood came from animals rather than humans. Edward revealed their nature during a weekend trip into the mountains, showing her his skin in direct sunlight, demonstrating his speed and strength, explaining about the vegetarian lifestyle and the family's choice to protect rather than prey upon humans. Bella's acceptance was immediate and apparently absolute, her love for Edward undiminished by the revelation of what he was, her fascination with the supernatural perhaps making her more attracted rather than less. Carlisle met with Bella after Edward revealed their nature, sitting with her in the house's living room and explaining more completely what they were, how they lived, why their family was different from other vampires she might have read about in folklore and fiction. He told her about his transformation in London sewers 3.5 centuries before, about discovering that animal blood could sustain him and allow him to live without killing humans, about the centuries of perfecting his control and his decision to use his immortal existence to help rather than harm humanity. He explained about building a family of vampires who chose compassion over their predatory nature, about finding each of them when they were dying and transforming them to save their lives, even though transformation meant cursing them with vampire existence. He told her about the treaty with the Quileutes, the boundaries they could not cross without violating the agreement and triggering warfare, the absolute prohibition against biting humans that kept the peace and allowed them to live in forks without constant threat of attack from the werewolves who existed specifically to destroy vampires who threatened humans. He was honest with her about the dangers of her relationship with Edward, about how her scent affected Edward specifically and powerfully, about how being in love with vampire meant living with constant low-level danger that could become catastrophic if control ever slipped even for a moment, if Edward's discipline ever failed, or if circumstances created situation where the thirst overwhelmed his commitment to protecting her. But he also saw how Edward looked at Bella when he thought no one was watching, recognized the depth of feeling that went far beyond simple fascination or bloodlust, understood that Edward had found in this one human girl something he'd been searching for through 9 decades of vampire existence. Carlisle had hoped Edward would find love, had wanted his son to experience the companionship and happiness that Carlisle himself had found with Esme, had worried that Edward might exist alone forever, unable to find someone who could accept his nature and love him despite or because of it. Bella represented everything Carlisle had hoped for Edward, even if the circumstances were complicated and dangerous in ways that kept Carlisle awake during the day, worrying about all the ways this relationship could end in tragedy. The James incident in March brought the dangers into sharp focus when a nomadic vampire coven passed through Forks and encountered the Cullens during a baseball game in a clearing far from human observation. The game possible only during thunderstorms, when the sound of bat-meeting ball could be masked by thunder. James, the tracker among the nomads, caught Bella's scent when the wind shifted and decided to hunt her. His obsession with the challenge of taking prey from another vampire overriding any respect for territorial boundaries or vampire courtesy. His mate Victoria and their companion Laurent watched as James fixated on Bella, his expression transforming into predatory focus that everyone recognized as dangerous and potentially unstoppable. The family mobilized immediately to protect Bella, splitting up to confuse James's tracking abilities, sending Bella away with Alice and Jasper while Carlisle and the others hunted the hunter, trying to eliminate the threat before James could reach Bella and kill her. The strategy failed when James outmaneuvered them, using Victoria and Laurent as distractions while he tracked Bella's scent across the country, following her to Phoenix where Alice and Jasper had taken her for safety. James eventually lured Bella away from her protectors by deceiving her into believing he held her mother hostage, exploiting her love for her family to separate her from the vampires trying to keep her safe, using her compassion and her willingness to sacrifice herself as weapons against her. The confrontation in the Phoenix Ballet Studio left Bella severely injured, her leg broken, her skull fractured, her ribs cracked, her hand bitten and injected with venom that began transforming her cells from human to vampire. Edward arrived with the family in time to save her life, killing James with Emmett and Jasper's help, while Edward made the agonizing choice to extract the venom from Bella's wound by sucking it out, fighting his thirst and his instinct while trying to remove the transformation catalyst before it spread too far through her system. The extraction was successful, but the damage was already done. Bella's injuries severe enough that she required extensive medical treatment. Carlisle treated Bella's injuries after the attack, setting her broken bones with the same care he would give any patient, stitching her lacerations with precision earned through centuries of practice, monitoring her recovery with professional attention, while privately marveling at her resilience and her commitment to staying in Edward's life, despite having experienced directly how dangerous that life could be. She had been attacked by a vampire, had nearly died, had nearly been transformed against her will. And yet, She showed no signs of wanting to distance herself from Edward or the family. No apparent desire to return to normal human life where vampires were fiction rather than constant present danger. If anything, the attack seemed to strengthen her resolve to become vampire herself, to join them permanently in immortality, rather than continue existing as vulnerable human among supernatural beings. The Cullens returned to Forks after Bella recovered enough to travel, the family resuming their normal patterns while Bella resumed her human life with new awareness of how fragile that life was, how easily it could end, how the gap between human and vampire represented vulnerability that terrified Edward, even as Bella seemed to accept it calmly. The summer passed relatively peacefully, Edward and Bella's relationship deepening, the family adjusting to having a human among them regularly, everyone learning to manage the complications and dangers that Bella's presence inevitably created. Then came Bella's 18th birthday party in September, an event Esme and Alice insisted on celebrating despite Bella's protests that she did not want attention or celebration. The party was going well until Bella received a paper cut while opening presents, the small amount of blood triggering Jasper's still imperfect control, his struggle with vegetarian lifestyle failing in that moment of temptation when the scent of fresh human blood overwhelmed his carefully maintained discipline. He lunged toward Bella before he could stop himself, his mind lost to bloodlust, his body acting on pure instinct. Edward shoved Bella out of the way, sending her crashing into a table covered with glass plates and vases, her arm opening in long deep cut that bled far more heavily than the paper cut had, the increased blood making the situation exponentially worse. Carlisle and Emmett restrained Jasper, forcing him from the room while Alice followed to help him regain control, while Edward stood between Bella and the door, looking devastated by what had happened. Carlisle treated Bella's arm with steady hands, despite the blood soaking through her sleeve, cleaning the wound and stitching it closed with precision that came from centuries of practice, his control absolute even as the scent of her blood filled the room and made the thirst burn in his throat. He was internally devastated by what had happened, by the proof that his family was dangerous to this girl, no matter how much they cared about her, by the evidence that even decades of practice could not eliminate the fundamental risk of humans living in close proximity to vampires who were fighting their nature every moment of every day. Jasper had not meant to attack, had spent years developing his control, had tried desperately to resist the bloodlust, but in that moment none of it mattered because instinct had overwhelmed discipline, and Bella had been endangered by the very people who loved her and wanted to protect her. Edward made the decision to leave Forks shortly after the birthday incident, believing that his presence in Bella's life was too dangerous to continue, that the only way to truly protect her was to remove himself and the family entirely from her existence, to give her the chance at normal human life that staying with him would forever prevent. He told Bella that he no longer wanted her, lied to her deliberately and cruelly to make her believe that his feelings had changed, that she had been temporary entertainment rather than genuine love, that she should move on and forget him and build a life with someone human who could give her the future she deserved. Bella was devastated by his departure, collapsing emotionally in ways that worried everyone who knew her. Her grief so profound that she barely functioned for months after he left. Carlisle supported Edward's decision reluctantly, understanding the reasoning even while questioning whether leaving would actually protect Bella or simply devastate her emotionally, whether the pain Edward would cause by leaving might be worse in its own way than the physical danger he posed by staying. The family relocated to Ithaca, New York, where Carlisle accepted a teaching position at Cornell while maintaining his medical practice at the local hospital, where Jasper enrolled in philosophy courses, where they all tried to adjust to life without Bella, even as Edward spiraled into depression that alarmed everyone who witnessed it. Edward and Bella's wedding in August of 2006 was everything Carlisle had hoped for his son. The ceremony bringing together human and vampire worlds in celebration of love that had survived separation and danger, and every obstacle that circumstance and nature had placed in his path. Carlisle officiated at the wedding, his voice steady and warm as he spoke the words that joined Edward and Bella in marriage. His joy at seeing Edward finally happy, profound and genuine. His satisfaction at welcoming Bella into the family officially outweighing his concerns about what her eventual transformation would mean. The reception was held at the Cullen house, Esme having transformed the property into something magical. The house and grounds decorated with thousands of flowers and lights. The celebration attended by friends, human and vampire. The atmosphere joyful despite the underlying awareness that this marriage represented commitment that would eventually require Bella to leave her humanity behind entirely. Bella and Edward honeymooned on Isle Esme, the private island off the coast of Brazil that Carlisle had given to Esme as wedding gift decades before, the perfect location for privacy and for Edward to be with Bella, without the constant vigilance required in populated areas. The honeymoon was meant to be 2 weeks of peace before Bella's transformation, which Edward had agreed to perform himself. After the wedding, as they had negotiated, the plan simple and agreed upon by everyone involved, but Alice called Edward after the first week with concern in her voice, her visions showing something unexpected, something that should not be possible given what everyone understood about vampire biology and reproduction. Bella spoke to Carlisle on the phone, describing symptoms that alarmed him immediately, even as his medical mind rejected the possibility those symptoms suggested. She was exhausted despite sleeping long hours, nauseous at the smell of food, her body changing in ways that seemed distinctly familiar. Carlisle asked careful questions about her symptoms, about the timing, about what had occurred on the island, his mind working through the impossibility while his medical training insisted on considering even unlikely diagnoses. He confirmed what he barely believed himself, that Bella appeared to be pregnant, that somehow Edward's body had retained reproductive capability despite being transformed in 1918, that male vampires were apparently not as frozen as everyone had believed. Edward and Bella returned to Forks immediately, the emergency cutting short their honeymoon, the unprecedented situation requiring Carlisle's expertise and the family's support. Carlisle examined Bella thoroughly, using equipment he brought from the hospital, performing ultrasound that showed what should not exist, a fetus developing rapidly inside Bella's human body, growing at rate far beyond normal human pregnancy. The growth was exponential and accelerating, the fetus already showing development that should take months occurring in mere days, the supernatural nature of the child evident in every measurement Carlisle took. He could not predict what would happen because no precedent existed. No medical literature covered hybrid pregnancies between vampire and human. No data existed to guide his treatment or prepare them for what was coming. The family divided immediately over what should be done. Edward demanding that Bella terminate the pregnancy to save her life. Carlisle agreeing reluctantly that the pregnancy posed catastrophic danger to Bella's survival. But Rosalie moved to stand beside Bella with fierce determination, declaring that she would not allow anyone to harm this baby, that this hybrid child represented everything Rosalie had lost when she was transformed, that she would protect Renesmee with her immortal life if necessary. Bella herself was absolutely resolute in her decision to continue the pregnancy regardless of the danger, her choice final and non-negotiable, despite Edward's desperate pleas and Carlisle's medical warnings about the damage the rapidly growing fetus was causing to her human body. The pregnancy progressed with terrifying speed, Bella's body breaking under the strain within weeks, her ribs cracking from internal pressure as the supernaturally strong fetus moved and grew, her spine beginning to fracture, her human frame simply inadequate to contain what was developing inside her. Carlisle monitored her constantly, documenting the unprecedented medical situation while trying desperately to keep Bella alive long enough for the baby to develop to viability, knowing that both mother and child would likely die if the pregnancy continued, but unable to act against Bella's explicit wishes. The breakthrough came when Edward heard the baby's distressed thoughts and realized that human food was not what the hybrid needed, that the fetus required blood to sustain its vampire nature. Carlisle brought blood from the hospital, and Bella drank it through a straw, the act horrifying her, even as it strengthened both her and the baby, buying precious time for development to continue. The birth came without warning when Bella's spine snapped completely, the catastrophic injury triggering immediate emergency that required extraction of the baby before Bella's body failed entirely. Carlisle prepared for surgery, but discovered that the amniotic sac would not cut, that no scalpel could penetrate the membrane protecting the hybrid child. Edward used his teeth to tear through the sac, lifting his daughter free, placing her briefly on Bella's chest before the hemorrhaging became unstoppable and Bella's heart began to fail. Carlisle worked frantically to control the bleeding while Edward injected venom throughout Bella's body, trying to spread the transformation catalyst before her heart stopped completely. Jacob Black performed chest compressions after Bella's heart ceased, manually circulating her blood to help distribute the venom, vampire and werewolf working together to save the woman they both loved. Bella's transformation took 3 days, while Renesmee grew and changed at the same impossible rate she had shown in the womb, the baby developing so rapidly that she appeared weeks old within days of birth. Jacob imprinted on Renesmee during those first moments after her birth, the supernatural bond connecting him to her absolutely, making her safety and happiness the center of his existence. The family cared for Renesmee during Bella's transformation, marveling at the hybrid child who should not exist, who was beautiful and aware and capable of showing her thoughts to others through touch, who represented something entirely new in the vampire world. Bella woke as vampire on the 3rd day with control that shocked everyone, her ability to resist bloodlust unprecedented for a newborn, her discipline allowing her to meet her daughter without danger despite Renesmee's appealing scent and beating heart. The family was complete now, with Bella as full member and Renesmee as the impossible addition no one had anticipated. The household adjusting to the presence of a hybrid child who brought joy and wonder and complications they were only beginning to understand. The threat arrived through Alice's vision in November, her eyes going blank as she saw the future unfolding, the Volturi coming to destroy them with their entire garden witnesses, convinced that Renesmee was an immortal child and determined to execute everyone who had participated in creating her or who had knowledge of her existence. Irina from the Denali Coven had seen Renesmee from distance and reported what she believed was violation of the most sacred vampire law, not realizing that Renesmee was born rather than bitten, that she was growing rather than frozen, that she was hybrid rather than transformed child. Carlisle immediately understood the magnitude of the threat, knowing that the Volturi would not listen to explanations given from distance, that they would arrive expecting to find law violation and would destroy the family when they did. The only way to survive was to gather witnesses who could testify that Renesmee was not an immortal child. Vampires from around the world who could see her growth and development and confirm that she represented something unprecedented rather than something forbidden. Carlisle sent messages to every vampire friend and ally he had accumulated over 3.5 centuries, calling in relationships built over decades and lifetimes, asking them to come to Forks and witness the truth before the Volturi arrived to execute judgment. The witnesses came from across the globe, covens and nomads arriving throughout November and early December, each one skeptical until they met Renesmee and saw her show them her thoughts through her gift, saw the evidence of her growth and development, understood that she was not the monster the law prohibited. The Denali Coven arrived first, devastated by their sister Irina's mistake, but committed to standing with the Cullens. The Amazon Coven brought ancient wisdom and Zephrina's gift of creating visual illusions. The Irish Coven brought Maggie, who could sense lies, making her testimony particularly valuable. The Egyptian Coven brought Benjamin with his rare elemental gifts. The Romanian Coven brought their ancient hatred of the Volturi and their willingness to stand against them regardless of the cause. Carlisle worked with Bella during this time to help her develop her shield, the defensive gift that could protect others from the Volturi's most dangerous weapons, Jane and Alec, whose mental attacks could incapacitate entire groups, but were useless against Bella's mental barrier. Through intense practice with Kate from the Denali Coven, Bella learned to project her shield beyond herself, to encompass others within its protection, to maintain it even under stress and distraction. The skill would prove crucial if the confrontation turned violent, if the Volturi refused to accept the evidence and chose destruction over reason. The Volturi arrived in December with their full garden witnesses, dozens of vampires converging on Forks, with expectation of swift execution. Aro and Caius and Marcus leading their forces across the snowy field toward where the Cullens and their witnesses waited. The confrontation was tense and terrifying. Aro reading Edward's thoughts and seeing Renesmee's true nature, but still uncertain whether to accept the evidence, whether to spare the Cullens or destroy them to maintain the law's absolute authority. Alice's vision of the potential battle showed Carlisle being killed by Aro, his head ripped off and burned, the image horrifying everyone who witnessed it, and convincing the Volturi that attacking would result in catastrophic losses on both sides. The resolution came through Noel, another hybrid who arrived with his testimony that vampire-human hybrids were not dangerous, that they reached maturity and stopped aging, that they were not the unpredictable immortal children the law prohibited. His existence and his evidence, combined with the witness's testimony and Bella's shield protecting the family from Jane and Alec's gifts, convinced Aro to retreat, to accept that Renesmee was not the violation he had come to punish, that the Cullens had not broken the law. The Volturi left without violence, their pride wounded, but their survival instinct stronger than their desire for dominance. Their retreat marking unprecedented moment when they had been forced to back down rather than enforce their will absolutely. Carlisle stood with his family in the aftermath, relief and joy flooding through him as he realized they had survived, that everyone he loved was safe, that the confrontation had ended without the death Alice's vision had shown. His family was intact and complete. Bella, finally vampire, and no longer vulnerable. Renesmee, safe and accepted. The witnesses departing with stories about the Cullens who had faced the Volturi and lived. It was victory hard won and peace uncertain. The knowledge that the Volturi might return someday lingering in the background. But for now, they had a home and family, and the life Carlisle had spent centuries building. Against all odds and all nature,